Okay, good evening, folks. If Tom is there, we can get underway. Perfect. Okay, right. I will remember to press the record button, or Sean will shout at me. We're already recording. I'm ahead of the game. Excellent. Okay. Right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the 2025-26 Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series. It's lovely to have you all with us tonight, and it's good to see so many of you in the audience. For those who don't know me, my name's Dr. Andrew Lind, and I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for Northern Studies, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now, before we get underway, for those long-term attendees of the seminar series, they'll know that I've got my usual spiel that I need to get through. And the first thing to say is that, as you'll have guessed, tonight's session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear on YouTube later on this week, make sure that you keep those cameras off and keep yourself muted. And you'll see that those settings are currently disabled. But what we'll do is once we've had the paper and we open the floor for discussion, I will enable those and you can switch them on and put your questions directly to our speaker this evening. I also want to just flag that you can also use the chat function. So if you'd rather put your question through that, I can read that out at the end as well. Now, the INS Seminar Series is a proud partner of the Explorathon initiative, which aims to publicise research at Scottish universities while making it more accessible and strengthening connections with our communities. If you have a moment later on, I'm going to post a survey in the chat this evening, which if you do have time, we would greatly appreciate you filling that out for us. Now, tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tom Fairfax. Dr. Fairfax recently defended his thesis at the University of Nottingham, titled Kinship, Connections and the Earldom of Orkney, 900-1263. And Tom is a familiar face to many of us at INS, having attended many INS events in the past. And on behalf of the department, we'd just like to congratulate him on his Viva victory. And many of the audience will know Tom from his previous papers and his published work on Norse and medieval Orkney, including his prize-winning study of Bishop Adam of Caithness's brutal murder in 1222, which is available on the Innis Review if you want to read that. Now, this evening, Tom will be presenting an overview of his PhD research with a particular focus on the manuscript which started it all, the Orkneyinga Saga, which I know that we're all very much looking forward to. So with no further ado, Tom's paper tonight is titled Families, Networks and Informants, the Making of the Orkneyinga Saga, and I will hand over to him now. A very warm welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the sharing slides, see if that all works. There it is. There we go. How's that looking?
That's perfect. If you just want to, that's it. Perfect.
Yep, all good. Okay. Right, I'll start. Thank you very much for having me. As you mentioned, I've been a few UHI events over the years, so it's lovely to get to share this bit of the PhD research right at the end, having been back and forth to Orkney quite a few times over the course of the PhD. I've been very lucky to be able to do that. So yeah, a huge thanks to the Institute for Northern Studies for having me. Thanks everyone for coming along. Today I'm going to be talking about families through my research on family connections, networks, lots of network diagrams and things. And we're going to be talking about really how these texts are put together. And I'm going to be sort of advancing a few ideas about how I think Orkneyinga Saga was put together. Some of them quite speculative and ambitious, others a little more safe, but we'll see how we go. So as a preface to this talk, I'd like to take you through a sort of a taster of the approach I'm going to use for the rest of it. And before we do that, we need a quick refresher on what Orkneyinga Saga is. I imagine a lot of you in the audience are very familiar with this text, but for those who aren't, here's a very, very speedy rundown of it. So Orkneyinga Saga is the title that we've come to know this text by. It means literally the saga of the people of Orkney. And it is in my view, it's mostly about this period that we would call the long 12th century, um, sort of the end of the Viking Age, right the way through until the early 1200s. Um, and my emphasis today is going to be on that, on the later part of that. So there's not a lot of Viking Age in this one, I'm afraid. But yeah, looking at that sort of late Norse period is what I'm going to be doing. This is a text that's believed to be compiled um, around 1200 in Iceland. And we have two different versions of the text at the moment. Well, two main versions, I should say. Um, the first ends in about 1171 with the death of Svein Leifesson in Dublin. And then the last event of the longer saga occurs in 1214 with the death of Earl David Haraldsson. An epilogue of sorts takes place in 1222. This is the text Brenna Adams Bishops, or the Burning of Bishop Adam, which I've done a paper on in the past. And so I'll be returning to that one every now and then through the rest of the talk. The main sort of plot, if you like, of Orkneyinga Saga, although it is very wide-ranging, is that it recounts these conflicts over the earldom of Orkney. And I'd like to start with perhaps the most famous one between Magnus Erlendsson, later Saint Magnus, and Haakon Pálsson. And this is St Magnus Cathedral here. And I'd like to sort of jump right into the middle of the story when Haakon is sailing to Egilsay with his sort of troop intent on killing Magnus. And this is what happens. This is from Judith's brand new translation, by the way, which I'm very lucky to have access to, so I thought I may as well use it. Well worth a read when people get hold of it. So we are told that when the troop, Haakon's troop, came together, the Earl, being Haakon in this case, makes it clear to his men that the meeting with Earl Magnus would establish that they would not both rule over the Orkneys. Many of his men were pleased at this plan and added many monstrous words. So that's sort of establishing that Haakon's the bad guy at the moment. And then we're told something about somebody else. Halvardur Gunnarsson, friend and advisor of the Earls, was on the Earl's ship, and he was equally loyal to them both. Haakon had concealed this evil plan from him, because Halvardur would certainly not have wanted to agree to it. And when he learned that the Earl was so committed to this evil plan, then he jumped off the Earl's ship into the water and swam to an uninhabited island. And that's really the end of Halvardur Gunnarsson's story in the saga. He appears a little bit before this, but this is his big act, jumping off a boat. And I suppose my thoughts, to use a modern phrase here, are who asked? Why should we care about Halvardur Gunnarsson? Isn't this story about St. Magnus? This seems to be such an incidental detail. It doesn't really change anything. Halvardur jumping off the ship doesn't mean that Magnus is saved. It doesn't mean that Haakon changes his mind. It really has no impact on the plot, other than to say Halvardur Gunnarsson wasn't involved in Magnus's murder, by the way. And Orkneyinga Saga is sort of full of these moments which seem to champion characters that maybe aren't necessarily important, or maybe shouldn't really be central to events. So why do we need to know about this? Towards the end of the saga, we get another of these moments involving the son of Halvardur Gunnarsson, who's called Magnus. And I'll just read through this quote, but this is taking place after the murder of Rögnvaldr Kali Kolsson, Magnus's nephew, in quite dramatic circumstances. And Magnus is speaking out, sort of in favour of Rögnvaldr, trying to, I guess, make a case for why his killer shouldn't get a truce. So then Magnus, son of Halvardur Gunnarsson, a high-ranking man and kinsman of the Earls, began to speak. He was the most prominent man in Earl Haraldr's troop. He said this: We cannot give you advice, Earl, after this significant deed, but I will say that, whatever people will say about it, if Thorbjorn, Rögnvalda's murderer, is given a truce after this deed, and also that he dares to tell you to your face in every word that he had done this evil deed for you or to honour you, it will bring everlasting shame and dishonour to you, and all the Earl's kinsmen if he's not avenged. I think that Earl Rögnvalda's friends believe that you will have for some time been advising the killing of Rögnvalda, which has now happened. Or do you think that he will say you knew nothing when he's denying the charge and there is no one to answer for you, when he now tells you to your face that he's done this bad deed for you? And basically, he goes on to say, well, if you're not going to avenge Rögnvalda, I am. And his brothers Thorstein and Haakon join him in avenging him. They run away and go and kill Thorbjorn. So again, Magnus, son of Halvar Gunnarsson, is not an earl. Why should we care? Well, I think it is because we are seeing this story, or at least part of this story, through the lens of the dynasty of Halvar Gunnarsson. And we're sort of shown this in another text. This is Íslendinga Saga, which is part of the Sturlunga Saga compilation. And here we're told about an Icelandic woman who marries a person called Eiríka Hákonarson from Orkney, who is described here as the son of the daughter of Sigurður the Pretender. But once you marry this information up with family information from Orkneyinga Saga, you get this. So here we have a person called Modern, his descendants Thorleif and Oythilda. Oythilda marries Sigurd the Pretender to produce Ingigerða, and so on. And eventually you get Eiríka Hákonarson, who's marrying the Icelandic woman here. This is the marriage we're talking about. And in 1993, Finnbogi Guðmundsson, one of the editors of Orkneyinga Saga, discussed this connection in his chapter in this book, The Viking Age in Caithness, Orkney and the North Atlantic, developing ideas he established in his own edition. Whoops, there we go. And he draws attention to this marriage. He shows that Guðni Thorvaldsdottir lived in Eyjafjörður in northern Iceland, and this is a place with good saga compilation pedigree. This excerpt in general shows an awareness of family networks in Orkney, although it sort of doesn't mention Halvar Gunnarsson. We can tell that this is definitely the right person we're talking about. Eiríka Hákonarson has to be the son of Hákon Claw. And by combining this information, we can suggest that these people are having something to do with the text. This is why Halvar Gunnarsson is seen as somebody doing the right thing in the story of St. Magnus, and why Hákon, Thorstein, and Magnus are shown to be heroes in avenging Rögnvalda Kali Kolsson. Now, Finnbogi goes much farther than I would here, arguing that Guðni's uncle Ingimundur was responsible for authoring the saga. I'm not so convinced about Ingimundur's involvement. I do think the involvement of Guðni's family has a lot of potential, though. This group, like the descendants of Halvar Gunnarsson, are involved in Norwegian civil wars of the 12th century, and these conflicts are bringing together people from across the North Atlantic. I think Orkneyinga Saga was created in this milieu, with relatives of the Orkney Earls mixing with saga compilers from Iceland. And I hope to convince you of this in the remainder of this talk. Halvarda and his family are not the only heroes of Orkneyinga Saga. As Judith Yesh said in a talk for the Viking Society just the other day, the narratorial sympathies of the text are not always consistent. This indicates that the narratives are coming from more than one place. We're dealing with lots of different informants from a number of dynasties. In the course of this talk, I'm going to highlight some other people who have extensive family networks in Orkneyinga Saga, and those who are portrayed positively in the text. Then I'm going to look at their descendants, who are in Iceland and Norway in around 1200. And then I'm going to look at what these people have in common, While this won't determine a single author of the saga, I think it can place the saga's origins on a slightly more secure footing than that which we have already. And it is that question of authorship which I'm going to engage with first. The fact that most sagas have anonymous authors has always been an issue for anyone really wanting to use the sagas historically. They face what Stephanie Gropper has called the stigma of anonymity. Without a named author, it's very hard to do the sort of basics of historical source analysis. You know, you think about what you're sort of taught in history as early as high school. You think, okay, who wrote it? Well, you don't have that information. Where? You don't have that information exactly. How are they doing this? Who are they doing it for? We don't really know any of this. And so as a result, it's really hard to do the basic work of history, the basic work of source criticism. Um, and I think this is best demonstrated by a case where the source criticism has happened. Um, and that is the amount of historical analysis done on Heimskringla. We have a named author for this, Snorri Sturluson, his statue in that picture there, who is the known compiler of Heimskringla, and people have used this association to argue that Snorri's politics during his lifetime influenced the way he wrote, that you can see a sort of ambivalent attitude towards the Norwegian kingship and his history. Whereas for Orkneyinga Saga, you instead have this nebulous oral tradition, which is really hard to trace. So how do we solve this issue of authorship? Well, as a shock to my historian roots, I found the answers in some classic literary criticism of the 20th century. I'm as surprised as you all are. In 1919, T.S. Eliot claimed that all texts are drawn from a living tradition. I think this problem as a whole requires the complete rethinking of what an author actually is and what they do. And it starts with Eliot here. He claims that all art is affected by art before it, and that this author is not a sort of original genius, but someone who is drawn from existing traditions to produce something else. In the 1960s, this erasure of the author figure continued. In 1967, Roland Barthes claimed that all text is a tissue of quotations. Essentially, the author's ability is not originality, but the power to remix various previous texts. And in 1969, Foucault discussed the concept of the author, concluding that an author was a function more than it was a person, and the function was to control the text, removing it from a free circulation of art and tradition, which didn't have specific authorship, and tying it into an individual, mainly so that the text can then be sold as a product of an individual. And crucially, he argues, some societies had more use for this author figure, this controller of the text, than others. And here I think this modern literary criticism approaches how medieval Icelanders saw their stories. A named author was not important, as an individual was only the latest purveyor of a general tradition. In the world of the sagas, stories were in the free state without the author function, which Foucault envisaged. So instead of looking for a single author, we can instead see the author of the saga as a compiler of tradition. And in my work, I found it useful to think of a saga author not as one person, but as a network of people. And this reflects the work of Slavica Rankovic, who proposed a theory of distributed authorship for Old Norse sagas. She argues that any piece of traditional art, like a saga, anything that's passed on, like by family tradition, local tradition, anything like that, is the product of a network. This network is a group of people at any one time, and it is multi-generational, reflecting input from previous generations. And in the written form, a saga is a reflection of the text at just one point in its development. So for Orkneyinga Saga, for example, we're seeing the saga as a product of a network existing around 1200 and earlier, but it keeps developing over time. You know, if we'd have interrupted the saga at, say, 1100, it would have looked very different. Or if we were to interrupt this narrative, had it continued on to 1300, it would have looked different as well. So we're really just catching it at this particular moment in time. So how do we get the provenance for Orkneyinga Saga? And how do we ask those historical questions with all these issues around authorship in mind? My approach was to try and identify the parts of Orkneyinga Saga's distributed author. In other words, I wanted to understand the process through which the saga was made. And here I've divided the network behind Orkneyinga Saga into three general roles, and I think this could be applied to sagas in general. The first of these roles are the informants. This group are the people responsible for preserving memories, transferring them to saga compilers. And the second stage is that of the compiler. Here, this might be the person we traditionally see as the author of the saga, but in reality, they're only shaping pre-existing material given to them by informants into something else. And the compiler is responsible for transferring oral traditions and other sources into a written text that we recognize as a complete work or something close. And the last group is the editors, who take the compiler's written work, put it in other texts, edit it, translate it, etc. For our purposes, this stage is still ongoing today. We've had a new translation of Orkneyinga Saga published just this year, which is very exciting. Now, as some of you will be able to see, this process looks fairly simple. You know, we're just going from left to right, but it has the potential to become extremely complicated. First off, we might have several compilers working with the same traditions. Then we might have informants who only contribute to some of the compilers and not others. And similarly, we have editors who only have the works of some of the compilers and not all of them. We must remember also that editors don't work in a vacuum, and they'll be influenced by each other's editions of the work. And in a similar sense, the informants can also influence each other, and even the compilers might influence each other. So we're not getting a sort of independent line of thought through all of these things. Everything circulates in each stage. And it could be argued, if we really want to complicate things, that the informants are not just people, but pre-existing written texts as well. And this makes the whole thing a real mess. This chaos aside, though, I think the authorship of a saga needs to be thought of in terms of these roles. I think the designation of these roles holds up, no matter the complexity. The informant, the compiler, and the editor. With all this theory out of the way, my aim for the rest of the talk is to find some of these informants, the people who were alive at the time of the saga's compilation, who were well placed to pass on stories to the saga's compilers in Iceland. To do this, we need to look at who the heroes are in Orkneyinga Saga. And we need to look at the people who have the most extensive family networks in the text. Then we'll try to trace their descendants, to see which family traditions made it to the final text. Just have a drink. So let's start with Rognvaldur Coulson. This is the nephew of Saint Magnus. His life in the saga is, well, very well documented in the saga. This is someone who goes on pilgrimage all the way to Jerusalem. He composes poetry, which is all in there. There's a series of escapades in Shetland, which are particularly entertaining. Rognvaldur achieves an awful lot in his lifetime. And I think part of the reason why we're getting such a positive view of Rognvaldur for a fair portion of the text is that, to some extent, there was a narrative based on him. His poetry is clearly the basis for some of the narrative, and there are several instances where he appears to control it. An interesting excerpt here from during his pilgrimage, which says, "Some said it would be foolish if they, being the people on the pilgrimage, did not tell the same story about such a major event. And in the end, they agreed that Earl Rognvalder should settle it. Afterwards, that would be what they would all convey. So here we can see almost Rognvalder's sort of authorship of the story before it becomes a saga as such. This kind of agreement to say things a certain way based on what Earl Rognvalder wants. And I'll return to him a bit later, but this is one of my network graphs. Well, I'll have a few of these throughout the talk. So this is Rognvalder here, and some of his relatives. So for my PhD research, I created a big diagram of all the people mentioned in Orkneyinga Saga and their family relationships. And one I want you to keep an eye on in future is this one, Erlinga Skaki, or Erlinga the Lopsided. He's a kinsman to Rognvalder and goes on pilgrimage with him. He's involved in this journey. Another key figure in the text is Svein Ausleifersen. Svein is not an earl, but he is a very important person in the text. Anyone who's read it will be able to say that. He's hugely important to the text. We quite often see events through Svein's eyes as they're unfolding. We get Svein's opinions, what he sees, where he goes, whereas with other characters we maybe get less detail. And if he's not an earl, then why would he sort of be involved in a saga which seems to be about the Earls of Orkney? Well, I think it's because he's involved in informing the whole narrative in some way, and the saga does make a couple of references to an account of events created by Svein. This is one point at which it does that. The saga stops for a moment and says, well, this is Svein's version of events, but there are others. But by acknowledging that there is a version of events by Svein, we basically have it sort of confirmed that there is a Svein tradition in Orkneyinga Saga. And this is really explored in a paper by Judith, which you can see here, called Presenting Traditions in Orkneyinga Saga. And in this one, she argues that a lot of this later part of the saga consists of a Sveinian strand and a Rognvaldian strand. And I think with that in mind, we need to think about people who are connected to both of these would make really good informants later down the line, because they're going to carry family traditions about Svein, but also about Rognvald. While looking for people connected to that group, this is what's called an ego network of Svein, which basically just means that he's in the middle of it. And we can see all his relations around. I think what's really interesting for Svein is that you get a lot of minor characters, people who aren't landholders and things like that. Whereas other people, you sort of don't get anywhere near as much information as this. A few I'd like to highlight at the moment is Kolbein Kruger here, who fosters one of Svein's sons, and we'll come back to Haraldr Madaðason later on. So speaking of Kolbein Kruger, that word translates to heap, or heap of something, I'm not sure what. I've always kind of hoped or thought that it might be referring to the kind of appearance of Cubby Roo's castle on the hill, although maybe not. It is in the picture to the right here. I will just catch up with myself. There we go. We hear a lot about Kolbein Kruger, but he isn't really involved in the plot, a bit like Halvarður Gunnarsson. We're told all this family information about him, but we're not really told why it's relevant. It just assumed to be. We're told that at that time a Norwegian man lived in Wyre in the Orkneys by the name of Kolbein Heap. He's a very outstanding person. He has a good stone castle in the picture. Um, and Kolbein was married to a relative of the Earl's. If you go back far enough, as you can see in the diagram at the bottom, you've got oh, you've got Kolbein Heap down here, and if you follow his wife back up, you eventually get to Earl Thorfinn, or Thorfinn the Mighty, who's sort of the ancestor of a lot of people in the saga. Um, Now, yes, we get all this family background, even though he personally isn't that integral to the narrative. Why? Well, once again, it's because I think he's attached to Saga informants. Um, one of which might be this man down here called Bjarni Poet. This is Bishop Bjarni of Orkney, um, who goes back and forth to Norway and maybe to Iceland, we don't know. But certainly his contact with Icelanders, as I'll discuss later. Crucially here, Kolbein's daughter Frida marries Svein's son Andreas down at the bottom there. That's the marriage which has been highlighted. And anyone descended from this marriage, I would argue, would be well placed to know about Svein's exploits and all this family information that we have about Kolbein Heap. Another network that is prominent in the saga is the dynasty of Modern. Although this person himself is quite obscure, he's an ancestor of loads of characters, including many earls. We can sort of look at parts of the family tree here. So, through a marriage of one of his, well, through a partnership of one of his daughters with Håkon Pálsson, we have earls here, earls here. Haraldr Madaðason down here. One of his daughters, Frakok, plays a particularly important role in the saga. Much of this dynasty becomes focused at her estate in Sutherland. And it's described like this. You know, they went away with all their household, first to Caithness, from there up to Sutherland, to the estates which Frakok had there. Erlander, the son of Harald the Smooth Talking, grew up there with her. Olvia Brawl, the son of Thorliot of Rackwick and of Stainvor, daughter of Frakok, was also brought up there. Margaret, daughter of Earl Haakon and Helga Modensdottir, and Eirika Staybrailer were also brought up there. These people were all of noble families. So we can see that all these people are given a certain amount of esteem. They're all sort of brought up in the same place. And they're all really important. And they're all influential in the saga too. So Eirika Staybrailer, or Stagbrailer, he marries Rögnvaldr Coulson's daughter, and is able to sort of make peace through that marriage. Ulfir Brawl is the killer of Svein Ausleifsson's father. Olaufer is his name. Thorbjorn Cleric, who's also in this family tree, down here, is the murderer of Rögnvaldr Coulson, that Magnus discussed earlier. And we also have Margrét Hákonardóttir, who's the mother of Haraldr Madaðason, and also is involved in a lot of political plotting around the defeat of a particular earl. And despite the involvement of this family in lots of quite negative sounding things, you know, we're talking about murders and killers and sort of scheming. There are times where the saga does seem to side with this group. Even after killing Rögnvaldr, Thorbjorn Cleric had sort of heroically escapes. Similarly, Margaret's sort of defeat of Earl Powell is not really criticised, despite the saga being quite generous to Powell as well. That might be because, you know, most people in the saga could trace their family back to Modern, or if not or most, then a good portion of them. It could even be argued that most people in the saga could trace their family back to Modern, or to Thorfinn of the Mighty, or both. And it's hard to believe that an informant would not come from this dynasty. So this is another group that we need to look at to see where the descendants are going to come from. We want to have a look at this group. Another point here, just to bring things back to where this talk started. Here we have Hákon Hávarðsson, the son of Hávarður Gunnarsson, who jumped off the boat at the start. We also have the grandsons of Rögnvaldr Coulson down here, who through their father are part of this dynasty. And we have Haraldr Madadason, who I'm going to discuss next. There's two of his sons that later become earls. Now, Haraldr's career is, again, quite detailed in the saga. He's apparently made earl at a very young age, and continues to be earl for much of the second half of the 12th century into the early 13th century. He's very close to a lot of people we might think would be able to inform the saga. Certainly Bishop Bjarni. He even gets on quite well with Svein at the end of Svein's life. Haraldr's son is fostered by Svein before Svein dies in Dublin. And Haraldr's son also travels to Norway to meet with the Norwegian king on several occasions once he becomes earl. So we know that this person is one of the most connected people in the saga. And while he's not always a main character, this is the guy in charge when a lot of this is being put together. So he's probably got some influence somewhere, and we can have a think about that as we go on. Interestingly, there's also a group that really rivals Haraldr at the end of the text. And this consists of Haraldr the Young, a grandson of Rögnvaldr Coulson, who is also a descendant of Modern. We pointed him out a little earlier. And it also has a guy called Raffin, who's a lawman in Caithness, established by Rögnvaldr, king of the Hebrides, during his incursion there. Now, in the 1980s, Michael Chestnut argued that this group were responsible for informing the bit right at the very end of modern editions of the saga, the bit after Svein's death. They appear to be based in Caithness and Sutherland and have sympathies for the Caithness landholders, for King William the Lion of Scotland, and basically anyone who is against Haraldr Madadason. And I think we can see the influence of these people in this part of the text by looking at Raffin Lawman's role in the burning of Bishop Adam. The quote here sort of shows one of the ways in which Raffin tries to improve the situation. He's sort of advising the bishop, and he says to the bishop, don't tax the people this much. I'm really worried about what's going to happen next. You shouldn't be doing this. And of course, the bishop dismisses him completely. Now, the title of that text tells you how that all ends up. Ultimately, Raffin the lawman is proven right. And this he's consistently proven right in this text in a way that suggests somebody with something to do with him was involved in putting it together. And we have evidence for that coming up. Now, I realise that this is a lot of people, all with quite similar names, just to be annoying. So before I move on to looking at the descendants of these guys, I've got time for a quick recap. So here is a family tree of the Earls dynasty in the 12th century. I'm sorry for all the family trees, there are a lot of them. And it all begins with Thorfinnr the Mighty at the top. Let's get the pointer out again. There he is. Our other big player is the modern dynasty, which encompasses all the people in blue right now. A lot of these people, as you might be able to make out, are both descendants of Thorfinnr and Modern. So that's one group to keep an eye on. We're looking for informants who are also descendants of that group. Next, we have this dynasty of Hávarður Gunnarsson. There's Magnus, who makes that speech. They're also linked to Modern through this marriage. So the children of this marriage here, like Eiríkr Hákonarson, are people who are tied to both the Modern dynasty and the dynasty of Hávarður Gunnarsson. So a good potential for an informant there. Lots of family background of people who are involved in the saga. Then we've got the network from Wire with close ties to Svein Ausleifsson. There's Svein's son Andres marrying Frida, and there's Kolbein Heap. There's Bishop Bjarni. Keep an eye on those people. And then we have Rögnvalda Colson, who has one daughter who marries into the modern dynasty, which produces these kids who are distant descendants of modern and the only living descendants of Rögnvalda Colson at this point. So at the end of the saga, these are the main family groups in play with members who are still alive. These are the groups we're going to follow into Norway and Iceland. So take a moment perhaps to familiarize yourself with some of these names while I have a drink in this intermission, because I've talked a lot. One moment. Have some tea as well. All right. I think we'll keep on going. Okay, I think it's time to look at the people who I think informed Orkneyinga Saga. But before we do so, we need some guidelines as to where and when we should be looking. First of all, we're looking at people who travel to Iceland and Norway. This is because the saga, at least in the form that we know it, was probably not compiled in Orkney itself. Its awareness of other Icelandic material would suggest that it is, this is a text that was compiled in Iceland by Icelanders. But these Icelanders were mobile people, and many of them, as we'll see, have links to Norway. We can find these people in sagas which deal with Orkney and the wider diaspora in the period after the conclusion of the saga. These contemporary sagas like Sverre's Saga, Hákonar's Saga, Sturlunga Saga were compiled by named people in the 13th century. We know who these people are. We know where and why they were put together. They were on a bit of a more certain historical footing. Our start date for our search for informants is at the end of Orkneyinga Saga. So either around 1171, when Svein dies, or after 1214 or 1222, depending on which version of the text we're talking about. So that's the kind of general range. And finally, where is our endpoint? What's interesting in this case is that an event recorded in Hákonar's Saga suggests many of our potential informants were wiped out. There's loads of people who could have informed Orkneyinga Saga who disappear. Many high-profile Orcadians were in Bergen after the murder of Earl Jon of Orkney, and the trial took place in Bergen. More on that later. But on their return from the trial, their ship was lost, meaning that many members of the Orkney elite that we might expect to have informed the saga in the period after 1232 have disappeared. Indeed, this period represents something of a decline in relations between Orkney and the Nordic world, with the earldom passing to a branch of the Angus family from Scotland. So our endpoint isn't a strict cut-off at 1232, but the informants have to be coming to an end at this time. So I might go a little bit further, but this is the rough endpoint I think we should be looking. So we're really looking at people at the longest range from 1171 through to 1232. Let's see if we can find any descendants of our family groups. So our first group actually comes from the end part of Orkneyinga Saga itself. This is the sort of bit that appears to be added on, covering the period up to 1214. And here we find members of this anti-Haralda Madadsson group, who travel to Norway to receive the approval of King Magnus Erlingsson of Norway. The king's father, Erlinga the Lopsided, Erlinga Skaki, who you might remember from earlier, went on pilgrimage with Rögnvalda Colson. Here he supports or he appears to support Rögnvalda's grandsons against Haraldr Madaðason, but it doesn't work out. First, Erlinga and his son, King Magnus, are defeated by their rival, King Sverrir of Norway. Note here in this quote on the left, we're told that Magnus Mangi, one of Rögnvalda Coulson's grandsons, dies with King Magnus in 1184. Not only this, but the dynasty of Halvarder Gunnarsson is back again here too. We're told that the son of a daughter of Halvarder, called Ivar Flor, this is the quote on the right, is killed alongside Erlinga the Lopsided. Ivar's son, Sigurd Sprat, stays with Haraldr the Young, one of Rögnvalda Coulson's grandsons, but both Sigurd and Haraldr are defeated. They receive a really positive write-up in Orkneyinga Saga, as seen here in the bottom quote, but despite this, they lose. Haraldr Madaðason kills them in Caithness. Ultimately, this shows that the court of Magnus Erlingsson in Norway had a lot of people associated with the modern dynasty, Halvarder Gunnarsson's dynasty, and Rögnvalda Coulson in particular. So this group is ticking a lot of boxes. There's people combining a variety of the family groups we've looked at, all mixing around in this royal court during the Norwegian Civil Wars. Another individual with saga connections crops up in Sturlunga Saga. Here, a man called Thorkell Walrus turns up in Iceland and manages to get in trouble with Snorri Sturluson, the saga compiler we talked about earlier. I can only hope that he was called Thorkell Walrus because he had a fantastic moustache. He generally sort of, in the text, causes a bit of a nuisance for Snorri. And it was as I was trying to find pictures of walrus in Iceland that I found this lovely news article. I kind of imagine Thorkell cropping up like this just to get on Snorri's nerves. And when things go wrong with Snorri, Thorkell flees to Oddi in the south of Iceland, where he meets a man called Sæmundur Jonsson, and we get told the following. When they reach land, Thorkell rode from the ship south into Oddi and called on Sæmundur to receive him, and he welcomed Thorkell because of the friendship he had with Bishop Bjarni, Thorkell's father's brother. What this means is that not only do we have evidence for a connection between Thorkell and Oddi, there's a long history of interaction between this family and Oddi. I think that's really interesting. And this voyage, although we can't put an exact date on it, is probably taking place in the first decade of the 1200s. And it's not the only evidence of connections between Oddi and Orkney at all. In another part in Sturlunga Saga, we're told more about Sæmundur Jonsson. He's thought to be the noblest man in Iceland at that time. He had a large, magnificent estate in Oddi and owned many other estates. He was not lawfully married, but words had gone between him and Earl Haraldr Madaðason, suggesting that he would marry Langleaf, his daughter, but Sæmundur did not wish to have a wedding in Orkney, and the Earl did not want to send her away from there. So this marriage negotiation falls through. But there was a negotiation, which is saying something. The other instances here are from a saga called Paul's Saga Biskups, which discusses the career of Paul Jonsson, Sæmundur's brother, who becomes Bishop of Iceland. And so during his life, we're told that Paul went abroad and was in the company of Earl Haraldr in Orkney, and he held him in great esteem. Later on, we're told about Paul's son Lopter, who went abroad and sought the homes of noblemen in other lands. He's doing his kind of grand tour, if you like. And one of the people he visits is Bishop Bjarni in Orkney, and then he goes to Norway and so on. Paul Jonsson is a very interesting person. So as I was researching this, I found out that you can actually go and see him. You can go and see the sarcophagus that they found that had him in it, and his remains are still there in Iceland. Anyway, I think All of this, in combination with the previous slide, is good evidence for a long-standing relationship between Orkney and Oddi, particularly between this family of Bishop Bjarni. Although there's interaction with Haraldr Madaðason, the sort of the friendship established with Bjarni suggests that maybe the bishop is the person going between the two about these marriage negotiations. Although we don't have evidence that Bjarni went to Iceland, we do have evidence that he went to Norway, and it might be that his interactions with Icelanders are actually happening in Bergen. So that even though there's this friendship, it's sort of indirect, if you like. In any case, at least by this kind of 1200 mark, we have people like Thorkell going from Orkney to Iceland, and people like Powell and Lopter going from Iceland to Orkney. Moving ahead slightly in time now, in the 1220s and 1230s, Helkonga Saga describes the career of a man called Snækolla Gunnarsson, who's described here as a descendant of Rögnvaldr Coulson. And I've talked about Snækolla for UHI before, in a St Magnus conference quite some years ago towards the start of my PhD. I did write up that paper, and I think it's coming out at some point, but this will have to do until then. Snækolla is a really interesting character. We know he's a descendant of Rögnvaldr Coulson, as detailed by this quote here, but quite what he was seeking to achieve in his life is a little bit obscure, but I think I've managed to work something out. Snækolla lived in Orkney, but was denied access to what he believed was his rightful inheritance in the Isles, and in a dispute with Jon Haraldsson, the Earl, Snækolla is accused of trying to claim the earldom, like his uncle, Haraldr the Younger, who you might remember. And shortly afterwards, the Earl and Snækolla go to Caithness, where after a night of drunken confusion, the Earl is murdered by Snækolla and his friends. And Snækolla runs away and camps out in Cubby Roo's castle in Wyre, which would suggest that he has some connection to this family of Kolbein Heap, which would make him a potential informant, as well as his connection to Rögnvaldr. Eventually, a trial is arranged. Everyone involved goes to Norway, and it's this trial which the ship carrying members of the Orkney elite doesn't come back from. Snækolla, however, wasn't on this ship. He stayed in Norway. He stays, quote, for a long time with King Haakon and his sort of on and off rival Skuli Barðason. Skuli is a kind of almost regent-like figure. He's a duke, but he isn't quite king. And a lot of Helkonga Saga is building up to this moment where they fall out. It's sort of an on and off rivalry, made even more awkward by the fact that Skuli is Haakon's father-in-law, but that's another story. Yes, others returning from that trial are lost in the sinking of the Geithinga skip. Snækolla is still in Norway. We will pick things up with him slightly later on, but needless to say, he's connected to all the right networks. He's connected to Rögnvaldr. He's connected potentially to the Wyre network too. If he's got access to Kolbein Hruga's castle, then I suspect there's some relation, or at least something going on there. And it is plausible he's a descendant of Svein. There is a Gunni in that family that we'll talk about in just a second. Our last group of potential informants appears later in the 1230s, sort of 1235-ish. The son of Raffin the Lawman and a grandson of Sveinas Leifason, both called Andreas, visit Orkneyinga, the son of renowned saga compiler Snorri Sturluson. There he is again in Iceland. Andres Hrafnsson is undoubtedly responsible for conveying his father's perspective to Iceland, which explains the sort of consistent bias in favour of Raffin in Brenna Adams Biscuits, for instance. And yes, as Andrew kindly pointed out, I did a paper on that text a while ago. If you want to find more out about Raffin the Lawman, then I'd suggest you go there. As far as Andreas Gunnarsson is concerned, he may have been able to add a few more details about Svein here and there, and Michael Chesnut does point out that the longer version of the saga describes how Svein's drinking hole in Gersey is split in half after Svein died. And that story can't come from Svein himself, so it must come from one of his descendants. And he suggests that it might be Andreas Gunnarsson. And I pointed out on the graph here, um, you know, so Gunni would be a son of Andreas, and then Gunni's son would be Andreas further on, all descendants of Svein Asleifsson and descendants of Kolbein Heap. There's a picture of lovely Oddie. It's well worth a visit. If we if we believe that these people that I've just gone through who are connected to the families of Orkneyinga Saga were the people who informed the text, and I do believe this, then what kind of people can we say that they were? Firstly, these are people involved in the Norwegian civil wars and the conflicts in Iceland and other places which evolved from them. These interlinked conflicts are evident in the closing stages of Orkneyinga Saga 2, with wars between Norwegian kings spilling over into battles for the Orkney earldom and back again. It does seem that if you make an alliance in one area, it has this knock-on effect in another. And if that is the thing that's going on after Orkneyinga Saga 2, is that generally they aren't that impressive. Well, somebody like Rögnvaldr Coulson goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His grandsons just completely fail to get hold of the earldom. Thorkell Walrus is only really notable for being a general nuisance. And this leads us to an interesting idea that, unlike what is commonly said about history, Orkneyinga Saga is a history written by the losers. I think this is a really interesting point, and I'd like to explore these networks further in part 4 and establish how these networks in the Norwegian civil wars can be associated with particular saga compilation centers. The first one of these networks is what we might call the Bagler network. This is the group in the Norwegian civil wars which fights against the Birkebeiner and ultimately loses. Or in one of its iterations, this group supports Magnus Erlingsson against King Sverre. And as stated before, Magnus's father Erlinger is close to Rögnvaldr Coulson, supports his descendants in claiming the earldom. The dynasty of Halvardr Gunnarsson's also involved. Ivar, Halvardr's grandson, fought alongside Erlinger. In addition, Gudny Thorvaldsdottir's wider family were also on Erlinger's side. Her family's lands at Eyjafjörður are home to a monastery called Kvera. This network seems to sort of converge, or the Icelandic part of this network appears to have converged there. And it's in this context that Gudny's marriage to Eirika Hákonarson, another grandson of Halvardr Guddason, probably took place. With Haraldr the Younger and his brother Magnus Mangi probably involved in this conflict, they probably supported King Magnus in the hope that if they were successful, they would have Norwegian support in overthrowing Haraldr Madaðason. But this wasn't to be. Sverrir defeats them both, and it's all over. An interesting addendum to this is that a relative of Haraldr Madaðason, Olafur, supports an attempt to make Erlinger's grandson, Sigurður, King of Norway. At this point, it would appear that the challenge to Haraldr himself is over, so he thinks he might try backing another candidate, but this fails too. Another context for the Informants is another Bagler network, and if we go back to Snæhotla, he reappears in Hákonar's saga when civil war breaks out between Hákon and Skuli Barðarson. Snæhotla backs Skuli, and Icelandic historian Helgi Thorlaksson has suggested that Snæhotla was intended to be Earl of Orkney under Skuli's hypothetical regime. And Skuli had already apparently made Snorri Sturluson Earl of Iceland in secret at this point. So he's sort of arranging his succession team for when he wins. But unfortunately, he doesn't win. And this network's also comprehensively defeated. King Haukon's men capture Snækotla, Skuli is killed in 1240, Snorri is killed in 1241 on Haukon's orders. In Skuli's faction, though, were several people with connections to families in Orkneyinga Saga, mainly Snækotla, but we could include the two Andreases here who had contact with Snorri Sturluson's son. Snorri's role in compiling Heimskringla shows that his estate was a place of saga compilation, which leads to the question, could a version of Orkneyinga Saga have been compiled there? Finally, the contact with Oddi needs to be considered as a context for the compilation of Orkneyinga Saga. We don't have many surviving texts from Oddi, but the shadow of these texts looms over those which do survive, particularly in the West. We have these interactions between Bishop Paul Jonsson, Thorkel Walrus, all these people. The context for Orkneyinga Saga is the championing of ancestors at a time when all these families were out of power. In this sense, we might call Orkneyinga Saga a nostalgia saga, for dynasties looking back at a golden age which is now lost. Why did Icelanders care about all this? Well, I think it's because that similar things are happening in 12th century Orkney and 13th century Iceland. There's this idea that Iceland might become an earldom in the near future. Snorri Sturluson is made an Earl of Iceland in secret, and even Gizur Thorvaldsson becomes an Earl for a very brief moment. Although it doesn't work out in the long run, I think there are a few decades in which it would appear that Iceland is to become an earldom dominated by Norway. And this might have spurred interest in Orkneyinga Saga. Orkney is probably the closest comparison they have politically. And this phrase, competition for an earldom, is what Gudrun Nordahl uses to describe the contemporary sagas, particularly Sturlinga Saga. And it's interesting because I think, in a way, Orkneyinga Saga fits the same bill, and that these texts are sort of working in parallel with each other. Time for me to wrap up. Sorry if I've gone on a little bit. And I know there's been a lot of people involved, but I will try and tie it all together with a bit of a bow at the end. This is me in early PhD days, pre-beard, scary stuff. At the early stages of my PhD, I was asking, can I find anyone from the Orkney earldom who might have informed the saga in Norway or Iceland in around 1200? That developed somewhat by the time that I was going around Iceland in Bergen, having forgotten to have a haircut beforehand. I was asking, can I find anyone from the Orkney earldom who's related to people in Orkneyinga Saga in Norway or Iceland in around 1200? But more recently, I've had another question on my mind. Having finished the whole thing, I kind of thought, can I find anyone from the Orkney earldom who isn't related to people from Orkneyinga Saga in Norway and Iceland in around 1200? And my answer is no, not really. And I think this tells us that the saga is not a generic history. This is informed by a very specific group of people. Orkneyinga Saga is not the product of a single author, but is the product of a wider network. It's informed, I think, by descendants of people mentioned in the text, travelling in Iceland and Norway for various reasons. And this informant material is brought together, perhaps in Norway, but probably in Iceland, to form what we know as Orkneyinga Saga. And we're talking about descendants of a very select group. Oh, I'll come back to that. I'll do that now. And if I were to try and put dates and times on it, which I'm a little bit reluctant to do, so I don't want to sort of hang my hat on all of these, I would maybe argue that version 1 ending in 1171 could well have been compiled in northern Iceland at Eyjafjörður in the context of those supporters of Erlinga Skaki and Magnus Erlingsson. The informants associated with this would be Eiríkr Hákonarson, who we talked about at the start, Haraldur the Younger, and Magnus Mangi, the people who are the descendants of Rögnvaldur Kolsson. The second version, the later one, might be one compiled in Western Iceland, perhaps by Snorri Sturluson himself or somebody in his milieu. the context for this would be the network of alliances surrounding Duke Skuli, who died in 1240. The informants here would be people like Snækotla Gunnarsson and the two Andreases. But behind all of either of these two versions has to be some input from Oddi in south of Iceland. And I think, it's interesting that Oddi has this sort of saga writing reputation, and yet very few texts from Oddi really survive. And I think something similar might be happening here. It's that material from Oddi is getting distributed to other saga centres and influencing it, but not sort of appearing in its own right. And the informants in this area would be people like Thorkell Rostunga, Bishop Bjarni, Icelanders travelling to and from Oddi and Orkney that we've discussed. So to conclude, what is Orkneyinga Saga actually about? I'm going to say it's not a saga of the people of Orkney at all. What Judith's done in a new translation is call it the Saga of the Earls of Orkney. And this is more precise. We are talking about a very limited group of people in medieval Orkney in this text. It is a history created by a small number of families. It's not impartial. The people who are championed in the saga are championed because the text is informed by people who have reason to champion them. And I think this is shown by the fact that whole areas of Orkney and the Orkney earldom are pretty much ignored. Like, we don't hear an awful lot about Shetland, despite the obvious evidence for late Norse occupation there. And we also don't hear a lot about, say, islands like Ide, which, could, for all good reason, have good late Norse archaeology on it. It has all the right place names, but because their family didn't make it to Iceland, the people who own the estate there do not get a say in the saga. And I think that's the way to look at this text. Okay, we can't put a named author on it, but this is a story that has been filtered through a certain group of people, and it's the group of people who are able to travel to Iceland and Norway and have their story recorded and told. And in that sense, the saga reflects circumstances in the whole kind of Iceland-Norway triangle, not just Orkney. With that, I will put this bibliography on the screen for a couple of seconds if anyone would like to come back and look at it in the recording. And then I will say thank you very much for listening. I know it's a lot of people and a lot of diagrams, but I hope that that has been interesting. If you found it interesting, then my PhD thesis will be online in December after I've graduated. And if you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, or you're welcome to get in touch on email or on social media and such. But thank you very much.
Fascinating paper. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. I'll give you a second to get your breath back. And then I will open the floor to everyone. So I've enabled microphones and cameras if anyone would like to put their question directly to Tom, but obviously you can use the chat function as well. I'll let people furiously type away.
I've got a question. It comes from the Shetland side of life. Is there any materials of this era that has any coverage of Shetland, or is it really just a bit of a dead space?
It's not a dead space. There's parts of the saga which are talking about Shetland. I think it's just that it's only in very sort of small doses, if you like, and it's only when main characters from somewhere else go to Shetland and end up there. My sort of working theory as to why Shetland isn't included is that it's integrated into the Norwegian kingdom slightly earlier. It's sort of taken away from the earldom of Orkney at the sort of in the 1190s. And so what that might mean is that whereas before you'd have people from Shetland with that power to go, oh, I'm going to nip to Norway, I'm going to nip to Iceland and such, they're being replaced by kind of imposed royal officials from Norway. So the people actually from Shetland, their stories aren't traveling as much because the royal officials are the ones doing all the traveling. But that's just a working theory. But I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Linda.
Hi. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And what I jumped out at me, and I'd like to ask Thomas, is do you think that your methodology, your work, has actually strengthened how we frame oral tradition? And it seems to me that you've completely strengthened the case for provenance, as oral traditions as a process as opposed to an event. And I love how you describe network authorship and give that you give legitimacy. I think we all know how much oral traditions have been used and have been colonized a bit to quiet voices and to take the narrative. And do you see your reframing, your methodology, as being something that can be superimposed into other sources of oral tradition? I mean, I don't know if I'm asking the question properly, but was that your intention to come across to create this methodology and to re-look at oral tradition and its and to acknowledge it as not primitive, as not unreliable, as it actually coming from a proper system, a proper structure? I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. I didn't go out wanting to say necessarily, everything said in a saga works and must be reliable, because, there's a lot of stuff in the earlier period of Orkneyinga Saga which does seem, quite invented, to be honest. But I think there's something about approaching these texts on their own terms. And I think a lot of people are just kind of go, oh, it's oral tradition, so it's rubbish, I don't care.
Exactly.
And I think that kind of dismissiveness really bothered me. I kind of thought, well, there is something going on here. This isn't all happening just by freak accident. I think that there is a process. And so that's what I've tried to do, and I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think going forward, I think, yeah, I think there's room for application with some other sagas. It might not work for all of them, but yeah, it would be interesting in sort of, some of the literature I've looked at talks about, instead of just saying that it's oral tradition, that these are orally derived texts. I think looking at them in general, this, by kind of putting it through this process and asking who the informants are, we can actually ask those historical questions a bit more.
Right.
You're not always going to have the records to get them, but I think, if you can access bits of that process, you can start to answer those questions a bit more, I think.
It was lovely to see how you picked that apart and put it together again.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Linda. James.
I'll put my video on this time and be a bit more social. You shared quite a lot of diagrams of the family links and things. Is there anywhere, have you got any repository online that people can access that to kind of look at it themselves?
Not at this exact moment. It's something I really want to do. So in the short term, I'm going to upload the sort of raw data to research depository in Nottingham. So just with the uni. So what that'll mean is that if you download it and download all the right programs, you can get those diagrams, and it should be completely repeatable. In the long run, I'd like to host it online. You might be familiar with the People of Medieval Scotland project, which looks at social networks and charters and has these diagrams online that you can browse through, and they're massive, far bigger than mine is. So it is doable. It's just working out how. I've not quite got to that point of understanding how yet, but it's something I'd like to do. Yeah.
Excellent. Public resources, open access resources are fantastic, Tom. Strongly encourage you to do that. Any other questions? Alison, come on in.
Hi, sorry. Hello, Thomas. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I was wondering what inspired you to look into Orkneyinga Saga from that angle, from families and things like that? What made you inspired by that kind of angle?
Yeah, so I did my master's dissertation on Orkneyinga Saga, and as I was doing it, I noticed, there's these big chunks of genealogical information, whole chapters which are just this person was related to this person and this person and this person and so on. And I just sort of looked at this and went, well, no, nobody does anything with this stuff. Like, it may not be the most exciting reading, but there's a load of historical information in here, that's sort of waiting to be used in some way. So I think that's really how I got into looking at it from that point of view, was sort of going, well, I really like this text. I find it interesting for loads of reasons, but what can I do that hasn't been done before? And all those names popped out. So that's kind of why. And I think in future there's a couple of smaller texts I'm going to look at, which are also sort of genealogies and things like that, and ask similar questions of. That's the hope, at least.
That's what I was going to
so-
ask you next, really, was is there another model in any of the other sagas like this where you can trace all the families?
I think it's going to be a slightly different conversation, because I think at least with this one, I could go to the contemporary sagas and go, I'm looking for people from Norway, not from Norway, looking for people from Orkney, Caithness, and track them in a way. Whereas if you've got a saga about Iceland and you want to find Icelandic informants for it, you're going to be spoilt for choice. And so determining those people becomes a lot more difficult. That's not to say it can't be done, it just might need a tweak. And I'm not quite sure how that would look yet, but I think there's certainly potential. It just might need a bit of adaptation. The model might need a bit of adaptation, but that's okay.
Thank you very much.
No worries, thank you.
Super. I'm going to put my neck on the line a little bit and ask a medieval question, which is dangerous for me. But I thought that was fascinating, Tom. I thought it was very convincing as well. But it's also quite confronting, because I think it fundamentally changes how you think about Orkneyinga Saga and what the text is trying to do. And I just wondered what your thoughts for that, and obviously starting out on your PhD, looking at the text in perhaps a particular way. Has your attitude towards the text changed at all, or has it made you think about what the purpose and the application of the text is moving forward?
I think my view of the text certainly has changed. I mean, I still think it's a really sort of wonderful mess of things going on in that text. You look at the first half, which I really didn't touch on in this talk at all. You've got stuff that's clearly sort of informed by the poetry, where the compiler is trying to piece together details based on words in the poetry to try and get this narrative to fit the poems and everything. It's really, it's almost a sort of unfinished kind of work in a way that we're looking at. It's really complex. So from that point of view of, I think I'll always be sort of interested in it. I don't think it now just sort of gets put on, oh, well, this is just a work of, representing these few interests. What I do think is important, though, is that, we know it by this title of Orkneyinga Saga, the saga of the people of Orkney. It's not about all of them. It really isn't. And if you look at, say, like Svein Leifsson, look at his network. He's got neighbors, tenants, sort of more distant relatives, all sorts of different people who are associated with him. And if you multiplied his network for every person in the text, and then all the other people who aren't even mentioned in the text that we know must have been about, you get this really rich picture of this whole society. And Orkneyinga Saga is not showing you that whole society, it's just showing you bits. But I think that for me is one of the differences. It's about sort of looking at this text as being it's not trying to tell Orkney's history. It's a history of a select few families. and that's fine, and that's interesting in and of itself. But I think, you know, it almost allows other studies of sort of medieval Orkney to kind of go, well, we don't have to find everyone in the saga that, you know, oh, well, we found a late Norse building. We don't actually have to attach it to anyone in the saga, because for all we know, there could have been, you know, hundreds of people unmentioned. And, you know, there's 500 people in Orkneyinga Saga, which seems ridiculous. It does when I started out, because you don't realize that as you're reading it. But, you know, even that is only a really small snippet of the society we're looking at here.
Yeah.
I think that's how my mind sort of changed as we're going
Yeah,
along.
no, really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Stephen.
Hello. I'll just turn the camera on there. I think I have. Thanks. That was great, Thomas. Thank you very much for that. And I think the whole idea of network authorship makes a lot of sense, because it's completely impossible to try and work out any consistent viewpoints in the saga. I think it's all really just when you think that the authors favour somebody, then it'll be completely undermined in some other way. So yeah, and you've sort of got the idea of later compilers putting things together, as you say, into this complete mess. But well, no, they shape something, a coherent mess out of it, I suppose. But one thing I was going to, well, it's not really a question, really, it's more an observation. One thing I found fascinating was that I grew up in Caithness, so I do a lot of stuff in the Caithness angle, and I was interested in 18th and 19th century Caithness writers talking about apparently lingering folk beliefs and things like Harold Modavison being wicked ill, Harold who's the scourge of Caithness, and Harold the Young still being seen as a saintly figure. And I suppose that made me think a lot about what actual common, what sort of ordinary people's perceptions were at the time, because obviously we only get the elite views, and it just made me think about sort of, you know, unwritten oral traditions, maybe from the rank and file of people in Caithness or Orkney or whatever, about that are kind of lost now, I suppose. But it was interesting to see those snippets from, you know, a couple of hundred years ago, of there still being these beliefs, sort of strong folk beliefs of who were good and bad characters and so forth, and good and bad earls. Anyway, it's not really a question or an observation, really, but.
No, thank you for that. It's really interesting thinking about those traditions which didn't get recorded. You sort of, because as much as, yes, we're talking about an elite group here, it's not just that they're elite, it's that their descendants are the ones who happen to travel. You know, there could be some really wealthy people who are just, you know, oh, well, they're not really part of this story, so they're not included. But they might have been hugely significant to everyday life for loads of people in Orkney or Caithness or Shetland. So it's that kind of, yeah. Instead of it just sort of being a vague, oh, well, this is oral tradition from everywhere. It's not, in my view. And yeah, it'd be interesting, you know, if we'd had all of these people go to Iceland and then we had a perspective from somewhere else. You know, we had a tenant who actually managed to go and, you know, claim that actually all these people are talking rubbish. You know, it would be nice to see something like that.
They were kind of all groups of losers, really, weren't they? In the sense that it all fell apart in the end. So it's which group of losers you're going to get the story from, really.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's the thing. I think we sort of think too much about. Sometimes there's a tendency to sort of focus on what actually happens as opposed to what looked like it was going to happen for a long time. It's something I'm really interested in. Even sort of in the modern day, it's like we're all quite influenced by what we think is going to happen. And even if that doesn't happen, that idea still had an impact. And I think for a lot of these groups, we're talking about people who thought they were going to be back in with a chance. You know, they thought that they were going to get hold of the earldom again. They don't, but this idea had a massive impact on their lives. So yeah, no, they're an interesting bunch. I've quite enjoyed looking at people who aren't necessarily the sort of star of the show in these contemporary sagas and digging into them.
Super, thank you, Stephen. It's an excellent article title, Groups of Losers, Orkneyinga Saga Re-Examined. That definitely has legs. I'm conscious
Loser
of,
Saga.
yeah, Losers of Inga Saga. I'm conscious of time, and Tom's been very generous in the discussion so far, but James has asked a good question in the chat, which I think is maybe a nice way to sum things off, which is essentially how trustworthy is the genealogy in the saga, and you know, are these kind of liable to exaggeration or, I guess, manipulation?
Very quick answer. It depends how far back you go. The ones at like the start are clearly rubbish. There's clearly a lot of like, you know, if you go back, but the same with a lot of medieval texts. You know, you go back far enough, you get gods, or you get Troy, or you get something, right? And Orkneyinga Saga is doing the same. We shouldn't deride it in that regard. It's part of a tried and tested strategy. Aside from that, a lot of it lines up quite well with what's going on in the King sagas. So you could claim that is something that would make it more trustworthy, although those are entirely independent sources. What I would say, though, is that the bit of the saga I'm talking about here is compiled within sort of, if not living memory, then pretty close. And so I think we can look at those genealogies as pretty good. And also another thing you've got to consider is that for a lot of these landholding families, there's lots of stuff in law codes. If you look at Norway at a similar time, there's provisions in law codes that require you to know like 6 generations of your family to be able to prove your ownership of certain land. So if you know if that's on the line, they need to be accurate. And if they're not, then somebody else can pull you up on it, and that could cost you a lot. So I think there are reasons to believe that the genealogy is generally trustworthy. Are there mistakes and errors made by later scribes, or you know, somebody hears something wrong? Almost certainly. But I think that's, you know, these errors are every now and then rather than just the whole thing's naff, if you see what I mean.
Perfect. Great note to finish off. I love when someone says naff. Fantastic word. I'd
I was
like
trying
to
to explain the difference between naff and faff to somebody the other day, which is quite good fun.
You can have a naff faff as well. I'm
And
reliably
it's true. It's true.
Thank you very much, Tom. Can I ask everyone to join me in the traditionally awkward round of applause over Teams? Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyable, lots of thought-provoking stuff there. I'm sure that if you have other questions, which I'm sure everyone will have, you can get in touch with Tom by email, and I'm sure he'll get back to you.